So I was just saying that we're going to introduce Saadia Gaon this evening, but the fifth and final installment in the series on Tameh HaMitzvot will actually be devoted entirely to Saadia. So as I said this evening, we'll get to Saadia, we'll introduce him, but the in-depth and extensive look at Saadia will be later on. Okay, so just a reminder that when we began last week, we looked at the subject of Tameh HaMitzvot, providing rationales for mitzvot, or even questioning whether mitzvot need rationales, begins already in the Torah itself, and that the Torah uses different words to describe mitzvot, and it's a difference of opinion amongst the rabbis as to whether these words should be treated entirely as synonymous, or whether the different words indicate different categories of mitzvot. And the two principal terms that are used are chukim and mishpatim, which appear in tandem very often in the Torah, either in the singular. We looked at the verse, Sam lo chok umishpat, or they appear in tandem in the plural, Hinei natati lifnechem chukim umishpatim. So the two different ways of looking at these two words are to say that the fact that they are separated by a conjunction means that they are two different things. And the other way is to look at them at what we saw is called a hendiadys, which is like saying nicely warm, which means that it's both nice and warm, but not as two separate things, but rather as a combination. Okay, so that we then looked and saw that in the Talmud, they take the position that chukim and mishpatim are two different categories. The category represented by mishpat is described as things that if they were not written in the Torah, we would observe them anyway. And the examples that are given are laws against murder, against robbery, against adultery, the kinds of things that are the bedrock of any stable society or civilization. And according at least to that piece of rabbinic literature, such laws are called mishpatim. And they are to be regarded separately from the other category, chukim, which again, the segment in the Talmud describes them as things she yetzer hara ve'umot ha'olam mishivim aleihem, things that one finds resistance to them, either on the part of non-Jews, or even on the part of one's own evil inclination. Okay, so we now move into the Common Era. Philo was a Jewish sage who lived in Alexandria in the 1st century of the Common Era, and we will take it from Philo through the Talmud into the era of the Gaonim, and conclude this evening with Saadia Gaon, who lived in the second half of the 9th and the early part of the 10th century. Okay, so one of the things that characterizes the Mishnaic and Talmudic approaches to mitzvot is the pressure that began to be applied on Jews and on Judaism by Christianity. And from the 2nd century onward, Christian attacks on the law provoked many Jewish replies in which the Jews would stress the importance of mitzvot and would argue that the mitzvot were given for the purpose of purifying people, of strengthening our holiness, our kedusha, and that furthermore, the performance of mitzvot enables us to acquire merit before God. So here, for example, we have two segments. one from a Tanaitic Midrash, Breshit Rabbah, and it's addressing the verse that begins the 15th chapter of Bereshit, the chapter in which God appears to Abraham in a vision and basically foretells the Jewish history. That is, descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land, etc., etc. So it reads as follows. It's apropos of the verse, Achar hadvarim ha'ela, hayad dvar Hashem el Avram b'machazeh, that God appeared to Abraham in a vision. So to this, the Midrash addresses a verse that's drawn from the book of Samuel, in which Hannah, in her prayer of thanksgiving to God, describes God as El Tamim Darko, a God whose ways are perfect, flawless, Imrat Hashem Tzirufa. And she says that the word of God is Tzirufa. Tzaruf means refined, okay? So given that God's word is described as refined, in refinement, there is an implication that there has been the removal of impurity. So to this, the Midrash says as follows, Im darko tamim hu, that if indeed God's ways are perfect, are flawless, hu alachat kama v'chama, then surely God himself is both perfect and flawless. Rav Amar, lo nitnu ha-mitzvot, ela litzrof et habriot bahem. So in contrast to God, who is flawless, man essentially is not flawless. Man is imperfect. Therefore, Rav tells us that the purpose of mitzvot is to refine people, to purify them. V'chi ma yichpat lo lakadosh baruch hu mi sheshochet min hatzavar u'mi sheshochet min ha'oref. Because if you stop to think about it, does it really matter to God whether the slaughter, the ritual slaughter, not only the ritual slaughter, whether the slaughter of animals in preparation for the consumption of their flesh, whether it takes place in the tzavar, in the front part of the throat, or it takes place min ha'oref, it takes place at the back of the neck? Either way, the animal's head is going to be severed. So what difference does it make whether it's severed from the front, which the halacha requires, or severed from the back? So the argument is that clearly the act itself is not significant. It's not the act itself that makes a difference in the status of the animal, but the act makes a difference in the status of the person who's performing the slaughtering. That if he does it the way it's prescribed by law, then that shows basically his obedience to God. And by performing the mitzvah, performing the slaughter the way the halacha requires it, he has been, as it were, rid of some sort of an encumbrance. He has been purified. As he says, Have litzrof et habriya, that the purpose of mitzvot is to purify people, to remove from them some sort of moral or spiritual encumbrance. Arguably, the same point is made in a well-known Mishnah. It's a Mishnah with which we conclude the reading or the study of each one of the chapters of Pirkei Avot, usually during the weeks between Pesach and Shavuot. So it's rather timely, rather apropos. Rabbi Chananya ben Akashia Omer, Ratzah HaKadosh Baruch Hu lizkot et Yisrael, that it was God's purpose to confer merit upon the Jewish people, lefichach, and in order to make them meritorious, hirba lahem Torah u'mitzvot. So why do we have mitzvot? Why do we have so many mitzvot? 613, as it were? Because the performance of mitzvot, or the observance of mitzvot, because remember, not all mitzvot are to be performed. Arguably, only 248 of the mitzvot are to be performed. The remaining 365 are to be observed. So the purpose of having so many mitzvot is lizkot et Yisrael, to confer merit upon the Jewish people, as it were, for the performance or observance of every mitzvah, you get a merit badge. So the more mitzvot that there are to perform and to observe, the more meritorious you are. Shene'emar, and there's even a citation of a verse to support this notion. Hashem chafetz l'ma'an tzidko, that God is desirable of the righteousness of people. Therefore, how does God provide people with an opportunity to be righteous? Yagdil Torah v'yadir, right? He magnifies the Torah, or if you wish, in a more literal sense, he makes lots of Torah. That is to say, lots of mitzvot. Now, that doesn't seem to be the same thing that it said in the previous segment. The previous segment said that the purpose of mitzvot is to purify people. The second segment seems to argue that the purpose of mitzvot is to take people, and it doesn't remove any kind of spiritual or moral encumbrance from them. It doesn't purify them. Rather, it just gives them opportunities to acquire additional merit. So in order to understand the resolution between these two sources, we actually need to go to a manuscript of the Mishnah. And here we have the same Mishnah, Rabbi Hanania ben Akash Omer, from what is considered to be one of, if not the most reliable vocalized text of the Mishnah. It's it's known by the collection in the library in which it is stored as the Kaufman manuscript, and it's dated reliably to the 10th or 11th century. And if you look carefully at the second line, right, and you see the word that's underlined, it says, Ratza hamakom, not hakadosh baruch hu, but hamakom baruch hu. That's an interesting variation in itself, worthy of discussion on another occasion. But it doesn't say lizkot et Yisrael, which means to confer merit. It says lizakot et Yisrael. And lizakot, like litzrof, means to purify. So arguably, the Mishnah and the Midrash on the previous slide are actually saying the same thing. It's just that the conventional way of reading the Mishnah is actually at odds with what seems to be its more authentic vocalization. So what we do find in the Talmud, however, is kind of like a pushback against the idea that that mitzvot are necessarily rational, and that it is incumbent upon us to seek their rationales. In fact, quite to the contrary, there is a theme that runs through the Talmud that maintains that reasons for the commandments were specifically not revealed by God himself. And if God chose not to reveal them, then actually we shouldn't seek to reveal them either. Indeed, the standard rabbinic phrase for observance of Torah and mitzvot is ol Torah or mitzvot, a yoke. And the yoke of the commandments, the term yoke doesn't lend itself neatly to the assumption that it is there in order to enlighten us, in order to purify us. It rather summons up the image of, if you wish, a pair of oxen who are yoked to a plow or to a wagon simply because that's their function. So indeed, we find a passage in the Talmud, in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, in which Rabbi Yitzchak says, Mipnei ma lo nitgalu ta'amei Torah. Indeed, we last week saw that there were several mitzvot, right? There were a number of mitzvot for reasons are supplied, but they are an insignificant proportion of the total number of mitzvot. So indeed, says Rabbi Yitzchak, why is it that generally speaking, the Torah does not provide rationales for mitzvot? And his answer is an historical one. Shaharei shtei mikraot nitgalu ta'aman, because in respect of two mitzvot, whose rationales are revealed in the Torah, nichshal bahen gedol ha'olam. It actually caused a great person, and the references, as we will see, to King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, nichshal, to stumble. What are the two mitzvot for which reasons are provided? It says in the rules dictating behavior of kings of Israel, it says, first of all, lo yarbelo nashim, that a king should not have too many wives. Okay, so King Solomon said, as it were, ani arbe, right? The verse says, lo yarbelo nashim v'lo yasur levavo, that he shouldn't have too many wives because they will lead him astray. So King Solomon said, well, that was meant to apply to ordinary kings. I'm extraordinary, and therefore I can take as many wives as I want, and I won't be affected. Uchtiv, and yet what does the Tanakh tell us about King Solomon? Vayi le'ed ziknat Shlomo, that in his old age, nashav hituet levavov, that indeed his wives did manage, in fact, to lead him astray. It further says about a king, lo yarbelo susim, that he should not have too many horses or chariots. Why? V'lo yashivet ha'am mitzrayim leman harbot sus, because apparently the market for horses in those days was centered in Egypt, and God did not want the Jewish people, I suppose, relying upon Egyptians. And once again, King Solomon said, no worry, ani arbe, I can have as many horses as I want, v'lo ashiv, but I'm not going to turn to Egypt for assistance. And here too, the Tanakh tells us, vatetzei merkava mimitzrayim, etc., that indeed King Solomon did rely upon the Egyptians. So in two cases in which the reasons for mitzvot are provided, King Solomon thought that he could basically outthink the Torah. Therefore, basically what Rabbi Yitzchak is telling us is that God thought it was much better not to provide reasons for the mitzvot, much better to require of us, if you wish, blind obedience, rather than specify rationales for the mitzvot and have people sit there. If you recognize this gesture, I'll do it again, right? It's the international symbol for pilpul, okay? So rather than have people sit there, as it were, and say, well, you know, the reason doesn't apply to me, and if the reason doesn't apply to me, then I suppose the mitzvah doesn't apply either. Same Rabbi Yitzchak, in a completely different Talmudic segment, asks again a rhetorical question. Lama tokin b'Rosh Hashanah, right? Why do we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah? And he answers by saying, Lama tokim? What a silly question. Rachmana amar tik'u. God says in the Torah that on Rosh Hashanah we blow the shofar. That's the only reason we need. Oh, maybe you think that's not what the question meant. The question wasn't, why do we blow the long blasts on the shofar? Maybe the question is, lama mri'in, why do we sound the tru'ah, the staccato blasts on the shofar? To which Rabbi Yitzchak gives the same answer. Mri'in, what a silly question. Rachmana amar zichron tru'ah. That again, the Torah says so. We don't need any reason, any explanation, any justification, any rationalization for a mitzvah, other than or beyond the fact that God prescribed it. Now, the interesting thing is that this very thought, in a reasonably contemporary period, was articulated by a leading Roman statesman, Seneca, who in one of his letters wrote as follows, and you don't need me to translate it this time, I condemn Plato. Why? Because Plato, not content with just specifying the law, added general principles, meaning Plato tried to explain the law. Seneca says the law should be like a voice addressing us from heaven. It should command, not discuss. Seneca says what he's looking for the law to do is tell me what I must do. Because he says, it is not for me to learn, but to obey. So the purpose of legislation is action, performance, observance, not necessarily understanding or comprehension. Now, it took an awfully long time for this to find an echo in a Jewish source, but there is one, okay? Rabbi Yaakov, the son of the Rosh, the author of the Arba'at Turim, right? Spain, early 14th century, wrote as follows. It happened to have come up apropos of his discussion of the laws of shaving the head or the beard, and a difference of opinion he had on the subject with an earlier authority, with Maimonides. So the introduction, he says, is hakafat harosh, right, shaving the head, hashchatat hazakan, or shaving the beard, gam be'elu, with regards to these two mitzvot, right, mitzvot lo ta'aseh, katav harambam, Maimonides wrote, she'asram hakatuv, why are they prohibited? Mipnei, that is to say, Maimonides provided a rationale that is absent in the Torah itself. She'osim ken ovdei kochavim. Maimonides reasoned that the reason behind these prohibitions is that they were practices of idolaters. Okay, and he says that ain't no miforash. While the Torah points out that this is not something that the Torah says expressly, it's Maimonides' opinion. Just like Plato, right, explains certain laws according to his opinion. And here the Torah echoes what we just saw in Seneca. He says, that is, we don't need to seek reasons for mitzvot. Why? Ki mitzvot melech heim aleinu, because they are royal decrees, and therefore they are incumbent upon us, af lo neda ta'amam, even if we do not understand them. So the argument seems to be that providing a rationale or a justification for the performance or observance of a mitzvah should not in any way affect our actual observance or performance of them. So we see that there was a lively exchange among scholars of a variety of different cultures and civilizations in the early centuries of the Common Era regarding laws, whether they were Romans discussing Roman law, whether they were Jews discussing Torah law. And into this we find Philo of Alexandria, as you see, born in the year 25 before the Common Era in Alexandria. Philo offered the first systematic exposition, providing reasons for commandments, and he did so in several of his many works. He presented the laws of the Torah as an ideal law envisaged by the philosophers, very much in the manner, so to speak, of like Plato's Republic. That is, the law that leads men to live according to virtue. And he went ahead and divided the laws of the Torah, first into positive and negative laws, right? A distinction that we've already seen, mitzvot aseh and mitzvot lo ta'aseh. And looking at it from a different perspective, laws relating to man and those relating to God. Another category of mitzvot with which we are acquainted, mitzvot ben adam lachavero and mitzvot ben adam lamakom. And he introduced a very interesting idea that all.
Right? Am I speaking for others?
Am I lost? Judy? Do you hear me? I don't know. I think
I hear you.
Everything is fine here.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Rabbi
we
Kelman,
hear
I
you
think
fine.
this one might be you. All right, I'm going to continue. I'm sure the rabbi will make whatever adjustments he needs. Okay. So Philo also saw something that we are going to spend time on in the final installment right before Shavuot, and that is that he said that somehow all 613 mitzvot are subsumed under the Decalogue, under the Aseret HaDibrot. That is something that Saadia de Gaon addressed, as I mentioned last week, in a liturgical poem that he wrote, the Azharot, and that's going to be the subject of our final installment on this subject. So I'm not going to say anything more about it at this time. But what Philo also did that was rather unique is that he assigned allegorical meanings to different mitzvot. And that's what we're going to look at. Okay? That one of the many works of Philo that deals specifically with mitzvot is actually called the Special Laws. That's just the English translation of the title, which is in Latin. Philo begins with a sketch of the way in which he proposes to treat the subject, followed by some remarks on the sacred number 7, right? And this, as you see, is his commentary on the 4th of the 10 commandments. So if you recall, the 4th of the 10 commandments is either Zachor or Shamor et Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho, right? To keep or to remember the Sabbath day and to sanctify it, okay? So what is, and since he believes that all of the 613 mitzvot are subsumed under one or another of the Aseret HaDibrot, what are the mitzvot other than Shabbat that are subsumed under the 4th commandment? He says that there are 10 feasts. And by feast, it doesn't, we'll see in a moment, doesn't necessarily mean opportunities to pig out, as we would say, but feasts in the say of days that may be marked by ceremonial meals, or they could be marked by other activities. And the first, he says, as I say, is the feast of every day. Now, we don't necessarily think of our ordinary Tuesdays or Wednesdays as being feast days, but Philo's explanation is that this conception, that the ideal life of a true philosopher is one continuous feast, is worked out by Philo with much eloquence, because feasting isn't only a physical activity. When we look at it allegorically, it's not just the corporeal feast, the physical feast, feeding the body. It's also a feast if we use the opportunity to feed the mind. The second feast, says Philo, is the Sabbath day itself. And after some remarks on the mystical properties of the number 7, right, Shabbat, he says that, of course, the essence of Shabbat is a necessary respite from labor, but even more so, you see the highlighted portion, a time for exercising the soul in contrast to the body. So it isn't just the abstinence from work that characterizes the Shabbat, but what do you do in the absence of work? And what you should do in the absence of work is to exercise the mind and the soul. He goes on and adds the prohibition of fire, the extension of the rest to servants, and the rest of household animals, right, is also noted. And with the Sabbath, we may associate other institutions that bear witness to the sanctity of 7. For example, the cancellation of debts during the year of Shemitah, in a 7, right? The liberation of slaves in the 7th year of the 7th cycle, okay? Leaving the land fallow in the 7th year and throwing the fields open, right, which encourages generosity to the poor. And finally, in the 50th year, the Jubilee year, the year in which estates return to original owners, with special regulations about houses and debtors and purchased slaves, and that's followed by some general remarks about laws of inheritance and the rights of the firstborn. So as you see, it's both traditional in many respects, but also quite novel in its introduction of these allegorical aspects. But the truth of the matter is that Philo is not alone in treating some mitzvot allegorically. We actually find allegory in the Talmud as well. I just need to switch here for a quick moment to share it with you. Okay, previous. Here we go. A Midrash Rabbah on this week's Torah reading. Part of this week's Torah reading in the Sidra of Emor is a recapitulation of the laws pertaining to the 3 pilgrimage festivals, the Shalosh Regalim. Okay, and this passage in Vayikra Rabbah deals specifically with the laws pertaining to the holiday of Sukkot, in which we are instructed to take a Prietz Hadar, Kapot Tmarim, Anaf Eitz Avot, and Arvei Nachal, the so-called Arba Aminim, the 4 species. And as you see, the Midrash treats these 4 species allegorically. Otherwise, how could you ever come up with the idea that the Prietz Hadar, that the Etrog actually is referring to God, and that the Lulav is referring to God, and that the Aravot are referring to God, and the Hadassim are referring to God? And then it actually changes pace, and it offers an alternative allegorical explanation, one that we're more familiar with, in which each one of the 4 species is identified with 4 different categories of Jewish people, right? The one, like the Etrog, who have both an aroma and a taste, and they represent righteous people who have good deeds. And then there is the palm branch, which has a taste but has no aroma, and that is understood to represent those Jews who have some Torah learning but do not practice good deeds. And then there is the Hadassim, right, which have a smell and no taste, and that refers to people who perform good deeds but don't engage in Torah study. And finally, there are the Aravot, which have neither a taste nor a smell, and they represent the Jews who neither study Torah nor perform any kind of redeeming good deeds. So that, as we see, it's not only Philo who engaged in the allegorical interpretation of certain mitzvot, but we find that the rabbis, Chazal, engaged in it as well. Okay. Now, let me get us back to where we were a moment ago. Okay. That brings us to Saadia Gaon. Saadia Gaon, as Rabbi Kelman introduced him very briefly, was a real Gaon. What do I mean by a real Gaon? What I mean is that I've often, remarked somewhat in jest to students that if one reads the Anglo-Jewish press today, one might think that we're living in the Gaonic era, because everybody who has smicha expects to be referred to as Harav HaGaon. So the word Gaon is actually overused. In the Middle Ages, in the High Middle Ages, the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, only 2 or 3 people at any time were ever referred to as a Gaon, because the title didn't mean so much a genius as it is its conventional understanding, but it was actually an official title. It was the equivalent of the dean. And only the people who stood at the heads of the 3 great academies of Jewish learning in the Middle Ages, 2 were situated in Babylonia, originally in the cities of Sura and Pumbedita, but from the 8th century on, both relocated in the city of Baghdad. And the 3rd was in the land of Israel, where, strangely enough, it was situated for most of the time in the town of Ramla. So the Rosh Yeshiva, the dean of the academy in the land of Israel, and the two Rashi Yeshiva, the deans of the two leading academies in Babylonia, were the only people at any time who were referred to by the title of Gaon. So when we refer to Saadia Gaon, we're referring to him not just as a person who was clearly, by any standards, a genius. Okay, he was one of the first, if not the first, grammarian, one of the earliest grammarians of the Hebrew language. He was one of the earliest people to translate the Torah. We've in our previous series on the Tanakh, we looked at segments of his Arabic translation. Okay, he was probably the first rabbinic scholar to write a systematic and methodical commentary on the Torah, addressing both its legislative and narrative portions. He was the first rabbinic scholar to write a systematic theology of Judaism. His well-known philosophical work, Sefer HaEmunot VaHadayot, from which we're going to see excerpts this evening. So although he was a Gaon, as a genius in a variety of different ways, he was called Gaon because for a period of time, right, roughly the last 20 years of his life, he served as the dean of the Surah Academy in Baghdad. And he was the first Jewish thinker, or at least the first whose writings have survived, to divide the mitzvot into two categories. One consisting of those mitzvot that are obligatory because reason compels us to observe them. And he called those mitzvot sichliot. Technically, he called them akliyat in Arabic. The sichliot is the Ibn Tibon Hebrew rendition of Saadia, okay? And the second category are mitzvot that are incumbent upon us because they were revealed, okay? And those are mitzvot shimiyot in the sense that we heard them, they were part of a divine revelation. Now, before we get into any of the details, I want to give you an example, okay? We've already spoken, we already saw the source in the Talmud that referred to mishpatim as laws that even if the Torah hadn't commanded them, we would observe them anyway because they are necessary foundations of an ordered and structured society, right? Like murder and robbery and the like, okay? And that category was called mishpatim. We saw that the same passage in the Talmud described another category of laws called chukim, for which it provided the illustrations of the prohibition against eating pork, right, and the like. When Saadia says that that the second category of mitzvot are mitzvot that are incumbent upon us because they were revealed, it was not his intention to say that because they were revealed, they obviously are not rational. What he meant was that reason alone might not have been sufficient to oblige us to keep them. And I'll give you an example. Shabbat, okay? If we look at Shabbat as a day of rest, we could argue that Shabbat is essentially a rational commandment because one of the things that's necessary in any kind of structured, ordered society is that people can't work 24/7, 365. So the fact that the conclusion that people need time off from work is eminently reasonable. However, reason alone would tell me that, yes, you need to take time off from work, but reason alone is not sufficient to tell me how much time I should take off from work, nor is it sufficient to tell me when I should observe that time off from work. The fact that we not only rest, but that we choose to rest one day a week, not every 10 days, not every fortnight, but once every 7 days. And furthermore, that it's not just that we rest 1 out of every 7 days, and in 1 week it could be Thursday, and the following week it could be Wednesday, but that the fixed day of rest, 1 out of every 7, is always the 7th day of that cycle. That is not irrational, but reason itself is not sufficient to make that obligatory. Therefore, Saadia would regard the mitzvah of Shabbat as a mitzvah shim'it, a revealed commandment, without implying thereby that it has no seichel to it, that somehow it is not rational. In fact, in discussing the mitzvot shemiyot, the revelational laws, Saadia held that while on the one hand they are primarily an expression of God's will, because they generally do not come accompanied by explanations, right? Nevertheless, they all have some sort of rational aspect, namely that we consider them to be useful. And anything that we find to be useful is ipso facto rational. Although he repeatedly reminds us that God's wisdom is so vastly superior to that of man that we might not in all cases be able to anticipate just what that usefulness might be. For example, he says, the fact that we have so many different holidays is to enable us to pursue spiritual matters and human fellowship, very much as we saw previously in Philo. Okay. Why do we have a kahuna, a priesthood? Because they provide us with assistance and with guidance in time of stress. Why do we have dietary laws? Because somehow, and this anticipates something that we will see next week when we look in greater detail at Maimonides, dietary laws somehow are a way of immunizing us against certain forms of idolatry. And here we have just some selections from the Book of Beliefs and Opinions, the Sefer HaEmunot v'Hadeyot, third part, in which Saadia addresses these two categories. And he says, now it is fitting that I proceed first to the discussion of the rational precepts of the Torah, the mitzvot sichliot. I say then that the divine wisdom imposed a restraint upon bloodshed among men, because if license were to prevail in this matter, if people were not prohibited from committing murder, they would cause each other to disappear. Very much in keeping, if you will, with the well-known Mishnah in Pirkei Avot that says, "Hevei mitpalel bishloma shel malchut," that one should recite prayers on behalf of the government, right? Not just the government of the state of Israel, right? But even governments of non-Jews. Why? The Mishnah says, "She'u malei mo ra'ah," because were people not fearful of the consequences of governmental action, ish et re'ehu chayim bela'o, people might actually swallow each other up alive. A very sad commentary on human nature, but a very astute observation of the purpose or function of law within a society. So Saadia says, the consequence would be, in addition to the pain experienced by the victims, a frustration of the purpose that God had in mind with regard to them, because their murder would cut them off from the fulfillment of the function for which he had created them, and in the execution of which he had employed them, right? Lo letohu bra'ah, says the Talmud in the Midrash on a number of occasions. God did not create the world in order for it to become chaotic. L'shevet yitzara, God created the world so that it should be settled and so it should be civilized. Finally, divine wisdom has made it one of its first injunctions that we speak the truth and desist from lying. This, like the prohibition against murder, like the prohibition against theft, is a rational commandment for the purpose of the preservation of orderly society. For the truth, he says, is an assertion about a thing as it really is, and is in accordance with its actual character, right? Whereas telling a lie is making an assertion about a thing that does not correspond to what really is or to its actual character. Therefore, what would be the consequence of hearing a lie? When the senses, perceiving it, find it to be constituted in one form, while the soul, reasoning about it, asserts that it is constituted otherwise, these two contrary views set up in the soul will oppose each other, right? Meaning what you hear and what you see will be in conflict. And on account of the mutual exclusion, the thing will be regarded by the soul as something grotesque. All I have to do is say fake news, right? Or alternative facts. And you can see the kind of confusion that can be seeded in a society when the lines of demarcation between truth and falsehood are blurred. And then Sadia moves to the second category, and he talks about acts which from the standpoint of reason are optional. Meaning, again, when you talk about the second category being a category of revealed laws, that's not to imply that they are not rational. It's simply to suggest that reason alone is not sufficient to compel them. Reason might suggest them as options, but not necessarily as requirements. And yet he points out the law, the Torah, has made some of them obligatory, right? Some are mitzvot aseh, others forbidden, mitzvot lo ta'aseh, and left the rest optional as they had been. And what do they include? Such matters as the consecration of certain days from among others, like the Shabbat and festivals. I already explained that. Or the consecration of certain human beings from others, the example of the Kuhuna, the priesthood, and refraining from eating certain foods. Right? We saw that example as well. And the avoidance of cohabitation with certain persons, right? Laws prohibiting incest and adultery, or going into isolation immediately upon the occurrence of certain accidents, tuma'ah, right, or tzara'at, because of defilement. Okay, these are not irrational, right, but looked at from the perspective of reason alone, without revelation, they become optional rather than obligatory. And again, just as a reminder of how close Saadia occasionally is to Philo, among the benefits accruing from the consecration of certain seasons by desisting from work on them, there is first of all that of obtaining relaxation from much exertion, right? Simply the abstinence from labor. But on the other hand, it also presents the opportunity for the attainment of a little bit of knowledge and a little additional praying, right? The benefits that accrue from using that time to spiritual advantage. It also affords men leisure to meet each other at gatherings where they can confer about matters of their religion and make public announcements about them and perform other functions of the same order. And yet, while we've seen these same themes, these same distinctions already in the Talmud and in the Midrash, there is still a very substantial difference between Saadia's presentation of them and our understanding of these same categories as we draw them from exclusively rabbinic sources. And that is the subject here of the final slide for this evening, and that is that Saadia has to be regarded as a pioneer. In some respects, as we've seen, he resembles Philo, with whom, to the best of our knowledge, he was unacquainted. But he differs from Philo and other philosophers who lived during the Greco-Roman period in that he defends the Torah as being divine commandments, and that the source of our obedience, even of the rational commandments, is not just that we find them compelling by force of reason, but it's because of our relationship to God as that of a servant to his master. Therefore, Saadia admits explicitly that the reasons for all mitzvot are not necessarily apparent to us. So on the one hand, he follows in the footsteps of the sages by distinguishing between the categories of mitzvot, the mishpatim and the chukim, those which deserve to be given even had they not been written down, and those that are incumbent only because the Torah prescribed them. However, he does not rely exclusively on the opinions of the sages of the Talmud and the Midrash. And in fact, as we just read in those passages from Sefer Emunot V'Dayot, he doesn't even cite them explicitly. He doesn't say, as it says in the Talmud. And this is not an accident, because the difference in the respective formulations of the Talmud on the one hand and Saadia on the other indicates a significant difference of opinion. The sages did not call the first category of mitzvot sichliot, nor did they say that it is our intellect alone that establishes them, while Saadia reiterated time and time again his indication that there is an autonomous source to our obligations. Meaning, from the perspective of the Talmud and the Midrash, the law is, to use again a term that I introduced last week, but I'll repeat it and define it again now, the law is heteronymous. Nomos is the Greek word for law or rule, right? Okay. Hetero, right? It's a prefix that we might recognize from a lot of different words, means other. So heteronomy means the source of authority is outside of yourself. Autonomy means self-ruling. So the difference between Saadia and the Talmud is not in the categorization of mitzvot per se. Both the Talmud and the Midrash on the one hand and Saadia on the other divided mitzvot very neatly into two overall categories, which we can call the rational and the revealed. The difference is that from the perspective of the Talmud and the Midrash, even the rational laws are entirely heteronymous, right? That is to say that the source of authority for them is entirely outside of ourselves, while Saadia was prepared to move away from that and to declare that there were within the mitzvot sichliot, mitzvot, commandments that were entirely autonomous, where our internal reason alone was sufficient to commend them minimally, commend in the sense of optional, if not to actually command them in the sense of making them obligatory. Next week, we'll move to both the Guide to the Perplexed, the Moreh HaNevuchim of Maimonides, the third part of which is devoted to a large extent to providing rationales for many of the mitzvot, including some of those that Saadia and the Talmud called chukim. And we'll also look at Rambam's categorization of mitzvot in his introduction to his Sefer HaMitzvot, to a book that he actually compiled, in which he lists one after the other the 613 do's and don'ts of the Torah and explains their details. I will have a quick look at the chat. Speaking of chat, Rabbi Kelman, a new book, Inside the Jewish Day School by Jack Wertheimer and I forget his first name, Pomson.
Alex Thompson. Alex Thompson used to be a professor at York and Toronto, and we were.
Yes, you were one of the subjects.
What do you mean? I'm one of the subjects.
Chat was
Oh,
one
yeah,
of the chapters.
of course.
One of the chapters in the book is on chat.
Yeah, well, Chat's the largest community day school in North America. I mean, high school, 1,230 kids this year, 4 grades.
Yeah.
It's Paul Shaviv, I don't think he's here tonight. He comes down there. Some of our classes, our head of school for about 15 years, wrote a whole book on.
Wrote a book about it. Yes.
Yeah, wrote a book. But so Alex Pomson does research in Jewish education. Sure, I know him relatively well, but he's been living in Israel already a long time. 15 years at least. And right, so this is what he does. And Jack Wertheimer, everything he writes is great. It's interesting they work together. Okay, very nice. All right, what's the book called? Inside the Jewish Day School?
Inside the Jewish Day. I think Inside the Jewish Day School.
And what do they say about chat?
I didn't get to the chat. I just got the book last week. Okay. I read the first chapter, which is about Hillel, Torah North Suburban in Skokie, and I just put my bookmark in the chat chapter.
Okay, you'll let me know next week, or you can send me. I don't know. I have to get a copy. Yeah. Chat is a unique school in many ways, but that's for sure.
Speaking of unique, there's really only one item in the chat this evening that is really apropos of the subject matter, and that asks something about whether the categories that Philo used were original to him or whether they existed previously. And as I said, the problem when we come to this era is that between the conclusion of the Bible, which is in the 5th century BCE, and the earliest portions of the Mishnah, which was only canonized in the 3rd century CE, right? We have an era of anywhere from 500 to 600 years during which there is no authoritative Jewish literature. There is a lot of Hebrew and Jewish literature in Greek that we spoke about when we were talking about the Bible, when we mentioned books called either the Apocrypha or the Pseudepigrapha. And indeed, we can learn an awful lot about them, at least in terms of what was conventional thinking. But there aren't any books that we look upon as being authoritative as we do on the Bible on the one hand, or beginning with the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Midrash on the other hand. So Philo is just one of the few literary sources that have survived from that period. And we really, I at least don't know whether in what respect he was original or in what respect he might have simply just been the one to give expression to something that originated elsewhere. I can tell you that one of the definitive studies on Philo, called Philo in the Oral Law, was the doctoral dissertation at Brown University of somebody named Samuel Belkin, who in 1942, I believe, became the president of Yeshiva College and subsequently was the first president of Yeshiva University. So obviously there is something in Philo that has to do with Torah Umado, with combining Jewish law and wisdom and philosophy on the one hand, and the best of secular wisdom and philosophy on the other hand. But more than that, I don't really know.
Rabbi Rakepet always says that we're missing a scholarly work on Dr. Belkin. He was really, in many ways, the one who built Yeshiva University, like all the growth, the medical school, the law school. So much happened under his auspices, and yet there's, he's sort of a forgotten figure, I think, for a lot of people. I don't even know how many people here really know anything about, Shmuel Belkin, who I never met. I mean, he died in 76, 75, and then the first.
It was when Lamb became president.
No, so Dr. Lamb became president, I think, in 76, but it didn't,
Yeah.
I think I know his yortzeit, I believe, is on Chol Hamoed Pesach, just like Rav Soloveitchik, right? I believe Dr. Belkin also is yortzeit. I don't know if it's on the same day or a day apart. I don't know exactly, but
Yeah. It's
anyways,
worse than that, Rabbi.
I'm sorry.
It's worse than that. They designed the library when they built the library at YU. They designed it in such a way that the foyer to the library was supposed to be an homage to Dr. Belkin.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yes, but then they went ahead and put the entrance on the other side of the building.
Yes, I'm trying to think. You mean the old library, like
No, the library, the existing library, the one that
have
according
they
to the
changed? Listen, I
architect,
don't know. I know they have a new base medrash. I was there, I think, once in my life. When I went, there was, First Hall and the base medrash and Reed's Hall. Now they have a new fancy base medrash. I was just there once, but I don't know how. Is the library still the same library?
The building that's contiguous with the new Beit Midrash,
It's the
one
library.
that's made of red bricks, that's the library.
That they haven't touched. It's the same library, right? The same
That's the
building.
library,
Okay,
yes.
fine. Okay. So I spent time on the 5th floor, the 4th floor. It's just
So
it's
the
been
third
many
floor,
years since I used
the
to hang out in
the entrance to the library on the 3rd floor was supposed to be an homage to Dr. Belkin. Then they went and put the door on the other side of the building.
Yeah. Listen, he was an Eloi, and I mean, I don't have to tell you. I'm sure you knew him relatively well.
Yes, he hired me. He was
he hired
first
you.
letter of appointment was from him.
Yeah, that's what I figured. So, and he came to America. He didn't speak a word of English, and then within 4 years had a PhD from Brown University, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
So,
that's what I just mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, but I'm saying that's like he didn't know English 4 years earlier. That's pretty impressive. But and he gave a Gemara shiur and whatever. Then he had a fundraise all day, so he couldn't teach. All right, what can you do? That's the life of leading a big organization. Okay, thank you. We look forward to next week the Rambam. Tomorrow, of course, Dr. Benny Gesundheit. I'm sure those of you who have heard him remember he gave the 30-part on Tehillim, 30-part series on Tehillim. And this class is always creative and energetic. He will be giving a 3-part series tomorrow, leading up to Shavuot. Tomorrow's topic is the structure of the Jewish calendar. I remember years and years ago, he spoke about in Toronto, these fancy diagrams. Trust me, it'll be things you haven't heard before. Then at 1:15, Mark Trencher is going to be talking about his recent survey on modern Orthodox singles and their relationship to the community at large. I don't think it's so great. It's a problem. Okay, that's tomorrow at 1:15. And tomorrow night, Nettie Linzer will be giving the Parshat HaShavua shiur. As I mentioned, recent or soon to be graduate of Princeton University, learned in the Migdalos. She'll be giving the shiur. It's my daughter Atara actually who recommended her, so that's tomorrow night at 8:30, and then my shiur at Friday morning 9:30 a.m. and then back to 9:35 a.m. and then Rabbi Liebtag on Sunday morning. Okay, any questions, comments, critique? Are always ready to hear. Okay, we look forward to learning with you. Please invite a friend and let's hear good things. And everybody have a Laila Tov and be well. Thank you very much.